Chapter 5. Ellen was on a mission the following day. She'd decided they'd waited long enough and it was time for Malinda to make a decision. It wasn't fair to make the men wait and interrupt their lives. Besides, it was Friday. Saturday would be a wonderful day for them to marry. She didn't feel the need to wait another minute. She waited until Malinda came down for breakfast, and although she'd eaten hers hours before, she sat at the table while Malinda ate. "I think we need to make a decision today. We can't keep the men waiting for an answer. It's not fair to them." Malinda shrugged. "I just can't make up my mind." She put down the muffin she'd been happily munching on as she looked at her sister. "I don't have any feelings for Patrick at all. I won't deny that. But what happens if Wesley dies and I'm left with nothing? Where will I go? I'm sure you'd move in with me. Just like you would if you married anyone else. Patrick and I wouldn't leave you destitute. Please, Mindy." She used her sister's childhood nickname in hopes it would get her to choose quickly. "I have 4 days to decide. You can't force me into an early decision just because you're in a hurry to get married." Ellen squeezed her sister's hand. "I think you know as well as I do that you need to choose Wesley. Nothing else would be fair to anyone involved. Wesley cares for you, and Patrick and I care for each other. Please do the sensible thing and just decide now." Malinda ate the last bite of her muffin and stood up. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to this. You gave me a week, and I'm taking a week." She pushed her chair in and left the room with her chin in the air, mumbling under her breath about how it was unfair to her to have to decide before she was ready. Ellen bit her lip as she watched her go. She had a right to make her own decisions, didn't she? She went up to Patrick's bedroom where she'd stayed the past 3 nights, and pulled out her wedding dress she'd worked so painstakingly on. She took it down the stairs to iron it. She was going to give Patrick a decision that night whether Malinda liked it or not. By the time lunch rolled around, she'd cleaned Patrick's room from top to bottom, the only part of the house the housekeeper let her clean. She'd ironed all her clothes and put them away in Patrick's closet. She was there to stay, and she really didn't care what Malinda said at that point. Over lunch, she kept the topic on simple things. "It's a beautiful day today. We should walk over to the park and spend some time there." Malinda eyed her skeptically. "You're just going to try to talk me into making a decision before this evening. It's not going to happen, you know." Ellen shrugged. "That's fine. I just wanted your company for a walk." After lunch, Ellen left Malinda to change into some more comfortable shoes for their walk and went into the kitchen. She hated sneaking around behind her sister's back, but she didn't want to have to listen to her complain about what she was doing all day. She spotted Alice at the stove, working on their dinner. "Alice?" The woman turned to her. "Yes? I'm going to tell Patrick tonight that I'll marry him. I'm sick of waiting on my sister. It's not fair to make him wait when he expected to be married the day after we got here. It's inconveniencing him too much to make him stay at Wesley's house." Alice blinked a few times and then a smile slowly spread across her face. "What does Malinda have to say about this?" Ellen shrugged. "I'm beyond caring what she thinks. I'll tell her after I talk to Patrick tonight." She did care, of course, but she just couldn't let her sister keep all 4 of their lives on hold any longer when the decision had been made. "What can I do to help? Would you plan a special wedding lunch for tomorrow? And a big cake? I can help you with it if you want." Alice shook her head adamantly. "You will absolutely not help. I'll take care of it." She turned back to the stove and stirred again for a moment. "I'm going to invite a young friend of mine over to fix your hair for you in the morning. Every bride should look her best on her wedding day." Ellen smiled and nodded. "I'd really appreciate that. Thank you." On impulse, she hugged the older woman before rushing to the front hall to meet Malinda. Malinda was waiting, tapping her foot on the floor. "Are you ready?" Or do you need to spend another hour talking to the cook? Ellen sighed. I'm ready. She opened the door to talk outside. I like Alice. She reminds me of Mom in a lot of ways. Malinda gave her a quizzical look. Why does she remind you of Mom? I'm really not sure. It's something about the way she moves in the kitchen. Being with her just makes me feel closer to Mom. Ellen shrugged. It wasn't really something she could explain, but the woman did remind her of their mother. Okay. Malinda's voice made it clear she thought her sister was crazy, but she didn't say anything else about it. The walk to the park took only a few minutes. There was a large group of children there with only 2 women watching over them. After a few minutes, Ellen went over to them. She smiled at one of the adults. Are you on a picnic? The woman nodded. We try to bring the orphans here at least once a month during the summer months. It's something they can all enjoy no matter what their age. She was distracted as she talked to Ellen, her eyes moving all over making certain the children were where she could see them and safe. Do you need help? I'd be happy to sit with the little ones while you push the others on the swings. The woman's companion was already off organizing some of the older ones into a game. I'm Ida. The woman held her hand out to Ellen. Ida seemed to be studying Elle as if seeing if she thought she was safe to leave the children with. I'm Ellen. She scanned the park quickly and saw Malinda curled up under a tree reading a book. That's my sister, Malinda. I'd love the help if you really don't mind. She quickly organized the children and had them walk toward the swings. Ellen sank down onto the blanket and picked up a baby who had started crying. Well, what's wrong with you? Ellen didn't have a lot of experience with children, but she'd always enjoyed being around them. The baby blinked up at her with huge blue eyes and her heart was lost. She spent an hour with the children before the 2 women came back. Ida smiled at her slightly out of breath from playing with the children. Thank you so much. You made our outing so much more special than it would have been. Ellen looked down at the baby cradled in her arms, sleeping contentedly. I really enjoyed myself. She carefully laid the baby on the quilt before standing and brushing off her dress. Thanks for letting me hold him. Her. That's Lucy. Ida smiled as she looked down at the sleeping baby. She's beautiful. Bald, but beautiful. Thanks again for your help. Do you live here in town? My sister and I just moved here. She didn't add her connection to Patrick, because she didn't want Ida to think he would be easy to get donations from. She wasn't sure how he felt about that kind of thing. She knew he was extremely generous, but that didn't mean he wanted every charity in town knocking at his door. Well, welcome. We hope to see more of you. She walked over to get Malinda for the walk back to Patrick's house. She wouldn't be able to think of it as a home until after they'd married. Are you ready to go? Ellen asked, looking down at her sister who was sprawled with her back against a large oak tree. Malinda looked up from her book. Yes. Did you have fun with the children? I had a wonderful time. She told her sister about how most of the babies had slept, but she'd held a beautiful little girl who she thought was a little boy the entire time. I guess I probably should have checked down the front of her diaper, but I just assumed it was a boy. The baby was bald. I guess it never occurred to me that girls are born bald as well. She laughed at herself as they walked. They chatted the entire way back to the house about the children and the book Malinda was reading. When they reached the house, it was almost time for the men to arrive. I want to change into a fresh dress before Patrick gets here, Ellen told Malinda as she walked to his room. She took pains with her hair and dress that evening, knowing she was going to talk to Patrick and end the suspense. Yes, Malinda should have a say in how things were done, because she was originally engaged to Patrick, but he couldn't be held to marrying a stranger when he had feelings for someone else. The only thing Ellen worried about was whether or not she'd find enough to do once they were married. She was certain she'd go insane if all she had to do all day was read books and plan menus. She'd been raised to keep herself busy and have a strong work ethic, and that wasn't going to change just because she'd married a man who employed servants. She'd thought about asking him to let the servants go and taking over the household duties herself, but both women had similar stories that told her they'd been incredibly blessed by the jobs he'd given them, and she wasn't going to take the jobs away from them. She walked down the stairs just before the men were due to arrive and immediately saw Malinda was still in her room preparing for their arrival. She'd been very disappointed in her sister during the time since they'd moved in with Harriett. Yes, she understood Malinda was worried about being poor for the rest of her life, but she also knew that Malinda had been raised to have a strong work ethic as well. Why did her sister suddenly think it was okay to sit around and do nothing just because there were others to do for her? Had her upbringing completely disappeared from her memory? Malinda came drifting down the stairs as soon as she heard the men's voices. Ellen greeted Patrick with a kiss on the cheek and saw, from the corner of her eye, that her sister did the same with Wesley. After dinner, they separated as always with Wesley and Malinda taking over the parlor while Ellen went to the porch with Patrick. She moved to the porch swing to sit with him. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, comfortable with their routine by that point. Once they were sitting, she turned to him. "I made a decision today." "What's that?" His brown eyes looked into hers, which were dancing with excitement. "I'm not waiting for Malinda any longer. If you want to marry me, let's marry tomorrow. Whether our siblings marry or not, I know I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Patrick studied her face for a moment before his split into a grin. "Really?" She nodded slowly, wondering if she'd been too bold. She knew her father would think so, but he wasn't there any longer. "Are you worried about what Malinda will say if we go ahead with it?" As much as he wanted to marry her, he didn't want her to ruin her relationship with her only living relative. "She'll be angry with me, but she cares for your brother. There's no need for her to keep our happiness hostage while she tries to make up her mind. She'll drag this out for another month or two if she can get away with it. She loves living in luxury. I don't think she'd ever choose you to marry, but I don't think she's in a hurry to marry Wesley either." She hated to admit it about her sister, but it was true. "Okay. Do we tell them or do we just marry and tell them after the fact?" He was prepared to argue with her if she thought they should just marry. He couldn't imagine getting married without Wesley by his side. "I think we should tell them this evening. I want them at our wedding." She stroked his cheek with her hand, feeling the bristles from his beard growing in. "But if they're not there, it won't be the end of the world. I'll marry you either way." He leaned down and brushed a kiss across her lips. "Thank you." She looked at him startled. "For what?" "For giving me a chance when you didn't want to marry a banker. For being flexible about your future. For not making me keep waiting. For being you." She brushed her lips across his, initiating a kiss for the first time. "I won't be marrying Wesley, and you won't be marrying Malinda, so what's the point in waiting? I'm so glad I have the chance to get to know you and marry you." He smiled into her eyes, obviously thrilled with the decision she'd made. "Do you want to tell the others now or wait?" "I want to put it off for as long as possible. Let's talk to them right before you leave for the night." She truly dreaded seeing the look on Malinda's face when she told her what they'd decided. "Do you want a morning wedding?" She nodded slowly. "I think that's for the best. I've asked Alice to prepare a special wedding lunch with a cake." He smiled at that, pulling her head down to his shoulder and wrapping his arm around her shoulders. He made a mental note to talk to Alice as well and give her an estimate on the number of people who would be there for the lunch. "That sounds good. I'll talk to my manager first thing and see the preacher." "How would you feel about 10 for the wedding?" "That sounds perfect. I already ironed my wedding dress and hung up all my clothes in your room. I'm there to stay." She'd loved seeing her clothes hanging beside his. He set the swing to rocking with his foot. I like knowing you're sleeping in my bed at night. When I'm lying on Wesley's lumpy spare bed, I think about how you must look with your head on my pillow all stretched out in my bed. She blushed. Your bed is very comfortable. Do you sleep with your hair down? I want to be able to get a more accurate picture tonight. The last night we'll spend apart. I usually put it in a braid so it doesn't tangle during the night. She wasn't sure if she should be talking about her nighttime habits with him, but since they'd be married in 12 hours, she thought it would be okay. I can picture that. How long is your hair when it's down? He knew it was longer than most because of how large her bun was. It goes to mid-thigh. She'd never cut her hair. Her mother had always said a woman's hair was her glory, meant to be seen down only by her future husband. I can't wait to see it down. She sighed, rubbing her cheek against his shoulder. I can't wait until I'm your wife and I can kiss you as much as I want to. Are you complaining that I don't kiss you enough? Because I can start kissing you more right now if you want me to. She laughed softly. Well, I like how much you kiss me, but it makes me feel like I'm doing something wrong now. After we're married, kissing will be what we're supposed to do, so I won't have to feel guilty over them. You don't have to feel guilty about them now. We're getting married tomorrow. He ran his hand over her back, happy that things were finally settled between them. I know, but it doesn't change anything. My father was very strict. He saw me making eyes at a boy across church one day, and gave me the whipping of my life. I was only 13, so it wasn't like I was going to run off with him or anything, but Dad believed we shouldn't even think about courting until we were 21. Most men consider women who are unmarried past 20 to be spinsters, but not Dad. She shook her head as she talked about how strict her father had been about his girls courting. I can see why kissing makes you feel guilty then. And about this boy. Why were you making eyes at him? Did you kiss him? He put as much jealousy into his voice as he could muster for a boy she'd made eyes at 7 years before. She laughed. I've only ever been kissed by one man. Of course, he was a boy, so you never know. He reached down and dug his fingers into her side, tickling her softly. Oh really? I'll never know? You won't tell me? She giggled and squirmed against him. Stop. Tell me. I've only ever kissed you. His fingers stopped and he rested his cheek against the top of her head. You didn't even kiss Wesley? She shook her head, tickling his nose with her hair. Never. He tried to hold my hand, but that didn't even feel right, so I didn't let him. Good. That's how it should be. You're mine and I like it that way. He drew her even closer to his side. They sat in silence for a while listening to the crickets chirp. I like Colorado. It's peaceful here. Being so close to the mountains provided her with a beautiful view every morning. He nodded. Your town wasn't peaceful? She shrugged. It was in a different way. I like being so close to the mountains. Well, I'm glad you like it here. I'd hate to have to move back east because my wife didn't like my home, but I'd do it for you. How did I ever get so lucky as to find someone like you? She truly couldn't imagine how life could get any better at that moment. She dreaded telling Malinda about their decision to marry, but she knew it was the right decision for everyone. Malinda would just have to get used to the idea of marrying Wesley, or she could not marry anyone. Are you worried about talking to Malinda? He asked, as if he'd read her mind. Yes, I am. I've never done something so selfish in my life as to decide to marry you tomorrow. She sighed, looking down at her hands. I feel like I'm doing something I shouldn't, but at the same time, I feel like I'm making the only decision that makes sense. I see no reason to make you wait because my sister is being fickle. His hand stroked down over her arm, trying to soothe her. It'll all be fine. We're doing the right thing for at least 3 of us, and probably the right thing for all 4. The fact is, you're not willing to marry Wesley and I'm not willing to marry her. Whatever decision she makes will still end in me marrying you. So she may not marry Wesley, but whatever she does won't affect us getting married. So why am I so afraid to tell her? She sighed after asking the question. She really did hate the idea of upsetting her sister. Because you've always done everything she's wanted for your entire lives? Because you're the older sister and think it's your job to take care of her? Because you're a caring, loving woman who feels like she needs to keep everyone around her happy? She laughed. You already know me so well. Don't sacrifice your own happiness just to keep her happy. Please. She looked up at him and brushed her lips across his chin. I won't. I couldn't. Because then I'd be sacrificing your happiness as well. Let's go tell them. Ellen sighed. I don't want to, but it's probably better to just get it over with. I do want her to be at the wedding tomorrow. I want her to marry Wesley tomorrow if she will. I hate leaving her in a lurch, but I deserve to be happy too, right? Would she be able to go through with it if Malinda refused to marry Wesley? Or would she feel the need to take care of her sister? Right. She stood up and he followed, holding her hand for support. She led the way into the parlor and knocked on the door when she saw her sister and Wesley kissing on the sofa. Excuse me. Malinda looked up at Ellen. Melinda's lips were puffy from kissing. Ellen couldn't help but wonder if the two of them talked at all or spent all their time wrapped in each other's arms. She started to scold her sister, but realized she was just as bad with Patrick and had no room to talk. Patrick and I have been talking, and we've made a decision. Ellen watched her sister carefully as she began talking. She knew she was in for an explosion, but it was necessary to get the discussion over with. What's that? Melinda's eyes narrowed as if she sensed what the answer would be before Ellen even told her. We're getting married tomorrow morning. We'd like the two of you to be there with us. She kept her voice calm as she watched her sister, waiting for her reaction. Melinda's eyes, which had looked sleepy and confused just a moment before, were suddenly shooting daggers at Ellen. What do you mean you decided? I thought it was a decision for the four of us. Ellen walked to one of the chairs across from the sofa and sat down so she'd be on the same level as her sister. The fact is, I wouldn't marry Wesley, and Patrick wouldn't marry you. Whether you two get married or not doesn't change the fact that Patrick and I will get married in the morning. She looked over at Wesley. I don't mean to offend you. You'll make a wonderful brother to me. Malinda leaned away from Wesley and crossed her arms over her chest. You can't just announce to me you're marrying him. He's my fiancé. Ellen shook her head. No, he's not. He's my fiancé. She took a deep breath for courage. You don't have feelings for him, Malinda. You care for Wesley. There's no need for you to be upset if I marry Patrick. Patrick moved to sit beside Ellen, taking her hand in his. It's true, Malinda. Having spent time getting to know you both, I know that the only woman I have any desire to marry is Ellen. I'm just not interested in you as anything more than a sister. Malinda didn't even acknowledge what Patrick said, and instead continued to glare at Ellen. She didn't say another word, just continued to stare, so after a moment, Ellen got up and left the room, going back out to the porch. I'm not going to put up with her pouting. Patrick walked up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, rubbing them gently. Whether it upsets her or not, we're making the best decision for all of us. Why would I choose marriage to a woman I know I could never love when I can choose marriage to you? She turned toward him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head on his chest so he wouldn't see the tears that threatened to spill. She felt like she was betraying her sister when she knew she wasn't. What was it about family members that could make you feel so torn about decisions you knew were right to begin with? Patrick dropped a kiss onto the top of her head. I need to go. I need to get up early in the morning to let everyone know our plans. He tilted her chin up so he could see her face. Are you going to be okay? She nodded. I'll be fine. It's just a sister thing. She knew Malinda would eventually forgive her, and she knew they'd work it out. That's what they did. They walked to the front door together, stopping to let Wesley know Patrick was leaving. Wesley and Malinda were speaking in hushed tones, and Wesley just nodded. I'll see you at the house. Patrick kissed her goodnight and shut the door behind him. I can't wait for you to be my bride, he whispered softly. Me neither. She practically floated up the stairs as she thought about how wonderful her life would be after she'd married Patrick. Chapter 6. Ellen didn't wait for Malinda to finish talking to Wesley before going up to bed. She knew there was a confrontation coming with her younger sister, but she just didn't want to deal with it. She was getting married in the morning, and she was determined she was going to be happy about it, no matter how Malinda felt. She quickly changed into her white summer nightgown. It was sleeveless and went to her ankles. The fabric was lightweight and perfect for sleeping in Massachusetts in the summer, but she'd found it was a little thin for Colorado. She'd had to tear up her winter nightgown for rags at the end of the winter, though, because it was too frayed to continue wearing. She was sure she could get another made before winter set in. As she braided her hair for the night, she thought about what Patrick had said about wanting to see her hair down. Quickly she undid the part of the braid she'd already done and stepped in front of the small mirror above his dresser. She pulled her curtain of hair over her shoulder and looked at it in the mirror. It was longer than even she had realized, almost touching her knees. She thought so little about it she hadn't noticed it getting longer. Quickly she rebraided her hair and slipped between the sheets. She was ready to sleep. It had been a long emotional day, and tomorrow would be another. Just as she closed her eyes, the door to her room slammed open, and she propped herself up on one elbow facing the door. Yes, Malinda? No one could make an entrance quite like her sister could. Why couldn't you have just waited a few more days for my decision? Malinda yelled. Ellen lay back with her head on the pillows. They'd been over this so many times. Why couldn't she just accept it? Because I was going to marry him no matter what you decided. Why should I wait just because you can't make up your mind? What am I going to do now? If I don't marry Wesley, I have nowhere to go. Ellen shook her head. You do have somewhere to go. You can stay in the room you're already in. Patrick isn't going to care. Maybe you can just live with us and keep stringing Wesley along for a year or two. Stringing him along? I'm not stringing him along. What exactly are you doing then? You care for him. You obviously want to marry him, but you won't tell him that. Why not? Tears escaped Malinda's eyes. You really don't understand, do you? No, I really don't. I think you're being unfair to 3 other people while you try to decide which is more important. Love or money? I assure you, love is much more important. She sighed. Are you going to be at my wedding or not? Malinda sank down on the bed with Ellen, brushing the tears off her face with the back of her hand. Of course, I'm going to be at your wedding. I wouldn't miss it. Ellen smiled, grasping her sister's hand in hers. I'm happy to hear it. For a while there I was certain you were going to ignore 19 years of sisterhood over money. Now that Malinda was calming down, Ellen knew they could talk openly and everything would be fine between them. It's not just that. I'm scared. I care about Wesley. I really do. But I'm not sure that I'm ready to be anyone's wife. I know. I don't think anyone is ever sure of that. You just have to trust your heart and move on with your life. Ellen sat up with her back to the headboard. Aren't you scared? Ellen blushed. Sure, a little. But I know Patrick well enough to know he'd never do anything to hurt me. He cares about me. And I know that about Wesley, too, but I talked to Harriett about, well, marital relations. She said the first time really hurts. Ellen didn't respond because she knew that Harriett had a very different sort of marriage than Wesley and Malinda would have. She hadn't been happy at all, and she knew that Malinda would be. The way Wesley looked at her told everyone how much he cared for her. "Aren't you worried about the wedding night?" Malinda asked. Ellen nodded. "Obviously not as much as you are. When Patrick touches me, I don't want him to stop. God wouldn't have made the way to make children pleasurable for just men. Besides, I've had friends who have married and they said only good things about the marriage bed. I really don't think we have anything to be afraid of." She reached out and patted Malinda's hand, hoping she would be calmer. Malinda bit her lip. "Do you think if I married Wesley tomorrow he'd agree to wait for relations until I felt comfortable with it?" Ellen shook her head. "I don't think you should even ask that of him. I think if you marry him, he has every right to expect a wedding night. Well, if I marry him and I'm not having relations with him, I'll still be cooking and cleaning and doing all the other things he needs his wife to do. I'll just sleep in his spare bedroom." Ellen let out a short laugh. "You wouldn't like his spare bedroom. Patrick says the mattress is lumpy and almost impossible to sleep on." "Well, I may talk to him about it in the morning before the wedding. I decided to go in my wedding dress just in case I decide to marry him tomorrow as well. It seems unfair that you and Patrick are marrying before Wesley and I are. That's your decision, though. Patrick and I decided we wanted to marry and left it at that. You're the one dragging your feet." Ellen knew the words were unfair as soon as they popped out of her mouth. She loved her sister despite their differences. Malinda stood up. "I'm sorry I was so mean to you about your decision to marry Patrick. I know you care about him, but I know you care about me as well." Ellen smiled up at her sister. "I'm really glad you're going to be there when I marry Patrick. How could I miss that? Of course, I'll be there." Ellen watched as Malinda left the room and then rolled to her side, snuggling into the pillow. She was marrying a wonderful man, and her sister would be there with her. What more could she ask for? Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Ellen went to the kitchen first thing the following morning as had become her habit. There were more pots going than Ellen had dreamed possible. Alice was obviously going all out as she fixed the special wedding lunch Ellen had requested. Alice turned from the stove and smiled. "How's the bride this morning?" Ellen felt as if her grin would split her face. The bride is excited and nervous and happy all at once. She felt as if she was floating as she skipped into the kitchen and took the toast Alice had fixed for her. She sat at the table in the kitchen and slathered blackberry jam onto the toast. "You make the best blackberry jam I've ever tasted. I'm going to have to get some cooking lessons from you." Alice nodded. "You can cook with me anytime. Just don't get rid of me, please." She said it with a laugh, because she already knew Ellen well enough to know she wouldn't do anything of the sort. "My friend will be here in an hour to help you get ready." "What time is the wedding?" 10. "That should work out just fine then. You can take a nice hot bath and by the time you're done, she'll be here to fix your hair." Ellen nodded. "That sounds nice. Thanks so much for setting that up for me." "It's no problem. I'd do anything to help Mr. Patrick get married to a girl who obviously has tender feelings for him. I really didn't like the idea of him marrying Malinda after I'd met her." Ellen sighed. "Malinda is truly a good person. She's just scared of a lot of different things. I think she'll marry Wesley today." She finished her toast and stood. "I'm going to go get started on that bath. I've got hot water heating now. I'll carry some up for you if you'd like." "Absolutely not. You have enough extra work to do with cooking the wedding lunch. I'll get it myself. It'll make me feel useful for a change." The only thing Ellen was still worried about with being married to Patrick was the amount of free time she had. How quickly could she look for volunteer work to do without him thinking that being married bored her? Once the tub was full of warm water, she sank down into it. She washed her hair with the soap Mrs. Smith had provided, and made sure she was clean from head to toe. She had just stepped out and dried herself when there was a knock at the door. Wrapping herself in the towel, she peeked out. "Alice sent me?" "She said you needed help with your hair for your wedding." The girl in front of her could be no older than 16 or 17. She was wearing a frayed dress that was as clean as could be. Her hair was a bright red, and she spoke with a slight Irish accent. "Come in. You're just in time." She looked around. Would a robe be a good thing to wear? I've never had anyone fix my hair for me before. She was looking forward to it, though. It would be nice to have her hair fussed with. The girl nodded. A robe would be perfect. Ellen turned her back to the girl and dropped her towel, wrapping the robe around her. She'd never been overly modest, but undressing in front of anyone went against the grain. "Where do you want me to sit? And what's your name?" The girl smiled. "I'm Angela. I guess I should have told you that." She looked around the room, and finally pulled the armchair from the corner, placing it in the center of the room. "This will do nicely." Ellen sat down while the girl pulled out a brush and some hairpins. She chattered away about how much she loved weddings while she brushed Ellen's hair dry. When she was finished, she carefully pinned up section after section. "How are you fixing it?" She hoped it would be a style Patrick would like. Not that he seemed overly fussy, but she wanted an elegant look for her wedding to him. Angela grinned. "I want you to be surprised. I think you'll like it." Ellen bit her lip as she considered. "Do you have time to do my sister's hair as well?" "Oh, of course. I have all the time in the world." Ellen had never had anyone fuss with her hair the way Angela was. She and Malinda had dressed each other's hair when they were young, just playing around with different styles, but neither of them had ever had anyone who knew what they were doing fix their hair for them. Finally, Angela pushed the last pin in her hair and moved around in front of Ellen. "That's perfect. Have a look." She gestured to the mirror over the dresser, and Ellen stood to peer into it. Her hair had been fixed in a style she'd never before seen. It was as if it had been rolled from the bottom up all over her head. She smiled and nodded. "That's perfect. Patrick's going to love it." Angela looked excited that she'd liked it. "You're a lucky woman to be marrying Patrick Harris. He's a good man." Ellen nodded. "He really is. I think I'm very fortunate to marry him." She opened the door and knocked on Malinda's door across the hall. Once the door was opened, she could see her sister had taken a bath as well and was in the process of getting ready. "Malinda, this is Angela. She's just finished fixing my hair for me, and I thought maybe you'd like her to do yours as well." Malinda's eyes widened and she smiled. "Oh, I'd love that." She grabbed Angela's arm and pulled her into the room, closing the door in Ellen's face. Ellen let out a half laugh as she went back into her bedroom, knowing she'd been dismissed. She pulled her wedding dress down from where it hung in the closet, and dropped her robe. After pulling on the stack of undergarments she'd laid out for herself, she carefully stepped into the dress, although she knew there was no way she'd be able to button every button. She'd planned to ask Malinda to help her, but she was ensconced in her room with Angela, and Ellen was certain she wouldn't see her again for a while. She buttoned as many buttons as she could on her own and ran down the stairs to the kitchen. "Alice?" Alice turned and immediately saw the problem. She rushed around behind Ellen and buttoned the rest of her buttons and then turned her around to study her. "You look beautiful." Ellen sighed with relief. "Do you think Patrick will be pleased?" Alice laughed. "I think Patrick would be pleased with anything you wore, but he'll really like this dress." "Did you make it yourself?" She walked in a slow circle around Ellen, inspecting the dress from every angle. It was a long white dress with lace that came up to her chin. It had a white satin bodice and skirt, but was covered with lace and had lace over her arms. Ellen nodded. "I did. My sister helped. We made our dresses together. Malinda is an excellent seamstress." Her sister was better at making tiny stitches that looked good on formal dresses than Ellen was. Ellen was fast, but her stitches weren't nearly as pretty. It's wonderful. You could make some money in a town like this with those skills. Of course, you don't need the money, but your sister might be able to make some extra to add to the sheriff's salary. Ellen decided to bring that up to her sister when she had the chance. It would relieve Malinda's mind to know there was something she could do to help her household's finances and maybe even support herself if anything ever happened to Wesley. She went back up the stairs and put on her pretty white shoes she'd purchased just for the wedding. They were uncomfortable and impractical, but she wanted to look just right for her wedding day. It was the only frivolous purchase she'd ever really made. Once she was ready, she sat on the edge of her bed and breathed slowly to calm her nerves. As thrilled as she was to be marrying Patrick, she was still nervous, wondering how things would go once they were actually married. Glancing at the clock on the mantel, she saw it was 9:15. He'd be there any minute to take her and Malinda to the wedding. She slowly walked down the stairs and saw him waiting at the foot. He was wearing a black suit and looked more handsome than she'd ever seen him. She smiled at him, not noticing that Wesley was standing right beside him, because she had eyes only for Patrick. "Is your sister coming?" Patrick asked after kissing her hand. She nodded. "She's getting her hair fixed." They heard a door at the top of the stairs open, and she watched with the others as her sister came down the stairs. She looked like a princess in her beautiful white gown. Ellen hoped Wesley and Malinda would be able to sort things out in time to have a double wedding. They all went to the buggy and she sat in the front with Patrick as she had when the men had first picked them up in Denver. It seemed like months since they'd stepped off the train instead of the 4 days it had actually been. She could hear Malinda and Wesley talking in the back, but she couldn't make out their words. When they reached the small church, Patrick put his hands on Ellen's waist and lifted her down, making her feel as if she weighed nothing. Wesley helped Malinda down and kept his hand at the small of her back as he led her to the others. He looked annoyed, so Ellen assumed they'd decided not to marry right away. "We're going to get married as well, and make it a double wedding," Wesley said, his tone biting. Ellen looked at Malinda, but her sister avoided her gaze. She probably didn't want to know what their little fight was about anyway. The two couples walked into the church together, and Ellen was surprised to see the number of people waiting for them. She'd expected a quiet ceremony with just the preacher, but there were at least 50 people there filling the pews. She and Malinda waited at the back of the church while the men took their places and walked to the front arm in arm. "Best wishes," Ellen whispered in Malinda's ear. They hugged one another before going to stand with their respective men. The ceremony was brief, but the preacher seemed kind. He was an older man, around 60, with silver hair. Ellen was surprised at how steady her voice was as she repeated her vows. She was agreeing to spend the rest of her life with a man she'd known for only a few days, and felt no conflict for doing it. She stared into Patrick's eyes as she promised to love, honor and obey him for the rest of her life. Patrick held both of her hands in his as he repeated the vows back to her. His warm brown eyes made her feel as if she could sink into them. When it was time for Malinda and Wesley to repeat their vows, she stood with her back to Patrick's front and listened to them. Malinda sounded almost frightened, and Ellen felt as if she'd done something wrong to ask her to speed up the wedding. When they finished their vows, she turned back around to face Patrick. The minister pronounced them men and wives and invited them to all kiss. Ellen felt shy about kissing Patrick in front of the people watching, but she raised her lips to his. He kept the kiss brief, but sweet, and then she was facing the onlookers. They were immediately flooded with well-wishers, and Ellen was introduced to more people than she cared to count. Patrick kept his arm firmly around her waist, and she was thrilled by that. It was much easier to face meeting all those new people knowing that he supported her. During a lull in the crowd, she turned her head to look at Malinda. Her sister looked miserable. What on earth happened between them? Patrick caught her look and turned to her with one eyebrow raised. His lips were against her ear as he asked, "What happened?" She shook her head as the next people came to meet her. Malinda and Wesley rode with them back to Patrick's house for their wedding lunch, and several of the people who had been at the wedding joined them as well. Ellen hadn't expected so many people and hoped Alice had anticipated this type of crowd. Once she was in the house, she knew the older woman had done her job to perfection. There were several extra maids on hand to help serve, and she was thrilled with the turnout as she took her seat on Patrick's right-hand side. Wesley sat at the foot of the table with Malinda to his right, although the two seemed to be avoiding looking at one another. The house had been decorated with flower bouquets strewn everywhere. The hall simply exploded with color, and the dining room had bowls of roses in pinks, reds, and whites throughout. The quality of the meals served amazed Ellen, because there had been so little time to prepare. There was an excellent vegetable-filled chicken soup with a rich broth, followed by baked fish with au gratin potatoes. For dessert was the huge wedding cake. Once the meal was over, Ellen talked to various people she'd met, always anchored to Patrick's side by his arm around her waist. She saw that Wesley and Malinda were standing apart and not even speaking with the same group of people. It was late afternoon before the guests cleared out, leaving only the two newlywed couples in the big house, along with a small army of servants who were clearing up the mess made by the group. Ellen turned to Patrick. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" Patrick nodded, though he removed his arm from around her waist with obvious reluctance. She went back to the kitchen and surprised Alice with a big hug. "Thank you so much for making everything so perfect. It was so much more than I ever dreamed it could be." Alice returned the hug with a grin. "I'm glad you enjoyed everything. I can't believe you were able to do so much in so little time." Ellen truly was thrilled with the work the older woman had done. "I'm just doing my job." "You do so much more than your job." Ellen turned toward the door. "I have to get back, but I needed you to know how much I appreciate everything you did to make today special." She walked out to the dining room and saw the other couple was still there. "Do you need some help packing your things, Malinda?" She could see her sister needed to talk, but she wasn't sure how to get her alone. Malinda nodded slowly and they went up the stairs to the room she'd used for the past few days. "He's mad at me," Malinda said as soon as they'd shut the door behind them. "I can see that. What happened between you two?" "He's mad that I suggested we wait to have our wedding night." Malinda turned away as she started putting her things into the trunk they'd brought with them from Massachusetts. "Well, of course, he is. I told you not to do that." "What exactly did he say?" Ellen wanted to yell at her sister. What had she been thinking to even bring up the topic? Malinda shook her head as the tears squeezed out of her eyes. "I'd rather not even say. He was really ugly about it." Ellen sighed as she helped gather up Malinda's clothes and carefully packed them into the trunk. "You need to do what you can to fix the situation as soon as you get to his house." Malinda shrugged, but didn't say anything. Ellen wanted to shake some sense into her little sister but knew it wouldn't do any good. Malinda was one of the most headstrong people she'd ever met, and once she'd made up her mind, there was no going back. Once the trunk was packed, she looked at Malinda one last time. "Are you going to be okay?" "Sure." Ellen shook her head and walked to the door, calling down that they needed help getting the trunk. Both of the men went up the stairs and carried it out, leaving the sisters alone again. Ellen looked at her sister and hugged her tightly. "We've never lived apart. This is going to be strange. We need to make sure we see each other often." Malinda nodded, the tears still threatening. "I'm going to miss you so much. You'll only live a 15-minute walk away. We can see each other every day if we want to." They walked down the stairs to the front door, and once the trunk was loaded into the buggy, Wesley drove them both home. "I'll return the buggy and horse tomorrow." He stared straight ahead as he said he words, not willing to look at his brother, because it would mean seeing Malinda. Patrick nodded, watching them drive away with a contemplative look on his face. "What happened between them?" "Malinda said something stupid and I think she hurt Wesley's feelings." She sighed. We have to let them figure it out for themselves. He looked at the clock and saw that it was only 5 in the evening. Are you hungry? She swallowed hard, suddenly nervous now that they were home alone for the first time. A little. They went to the kitchen and found a small casserole left to warm in the oven. Your staff is amazing. Our staff. Our home. Our lives. Patrick smiled as he said the words, thrilled that he could finally say them to her. She smiled and nodded. I love that. She took a towel and removed the hot dish from the oven and pulled down plates from the cupboard. She set the table in the kitchen and fixed their plates for their first meal alone together. They ate slowly without saying much. She couldn't stop worrying about her sister. She just hoped she did the right thing and was able to fix things with her husband. She stood up to do the dishes after they finished eating, but he stopped her. We'll just put them in the sink for Alice to do on Monday. She looked at him in shock. I can't just put the dishes in the sink. They'll only take a minute. She'd never left dishes overnight in her life. He stilled her hands when she went to fill the sink with water. They'll keep. She sighed. At least let me soak them so they'll be easier to clean. He just leaned against the counter watching her, his dark eyes filled with heat. When she was finished, he took her hand and led her out to the back porch, and they settled on the swing. This is my favorite place in your house. And my favorite time of day. I love sitting out here with you. Our house, he reminded her as he dropped a kiss on top of her head. She leaned back against him happily, staring out at the quiet garden. I'm so glad we decided not to wait any longer. Even though it had obviously made Malinda very unhappy. He ran his hand up and down her arm. I am too. And not just because I couldn't handle another night in that lumpy bed. She stifled a yawn. She'd gotten up earlier than usual that morning to get ready for the wedding and make sure everything was going right in the kitchen. It's only 7:30 and I'm already tired. We can call it an early night if you'd like. I haven't been getting much sleep at Wesley's house. She swallowed hard, knowing very well what an early night would mean. That sounds nice. If she went upstairs now, she could get the wedding night she feared over with. She knew what would happen between them, but the reality of it was more than a little frightening. He stood and held his hand out to help her out of the swing. I'll give you a few minutes before I come up. Thank you. She brushed her lips across his before climbing the stairs. Chapter 7. Once Ellen was in their bedroom, she stood for a moment with her hand over her heart, trying to calm its out-of-control beating. She knew she didn't have much time, but she was so nervous. She stood there for a full minute before she remembered she'd need his help getting her dress unbuttoned. So instead of changing into her nightgown, she reached up and started pulling pins out of her hair. He'd expressed an interest in seeing it down, and she could have it down for him when he came upstairs. When Patrick did come up to their room, she just removed the last pin and was taking her first swipe over her hair with a hairbrush. Patrick opened the door and stopped short. I'm sorry. I thought I'd given you enough time. He stared at her in wonder, obviously entranced by her hair. Do you want me to go? She smiled at him. I remembered after I got up here I can't get out of my dress by myself. She turned her back to him. There are too many buttons. She pulled her hair out of the way so he could see the line of buttons that went from her collar down to her waist, ending just above the curve of her bottom. He took a step toward her, his fingers going straight to the top button. I guess I'm good for something. She laughed softly. I'm glad you're here. This would be very uncomfortable to sleep in. He took his time unbuttoning her. The buttons were tiny and his fingers kept fumbling over them. By the time he reached the bottom button, there was a fine sheen of sweat across his brow. He pushed the dress forward and off her shoulders. She was startled by the movement and caught the dress before it could fall too far forward. She blushed as she realized he had every right to see her, and let the dress fall to the floor. She turned to him wearing only her corset and petticoat, watching his face as he saw her mostly unclothed for the first time. She dropped the hand that was holding her hair, and let it fall in a cascade over her shoulders. "You're beautiful," he mumbled as he dropped his head to brush his lips across hers. She wound her arms around his neck and kissed him back, wanting their first real kiss as man and wife to be special. Sure, they'd kissed at the church, but this was different. This time there was no audience, and the kiss was for their own pleasure, not for show. He tongue traced the seam of her lips for a moment, before she opened her mouth wide for him. His tongue invaded her mouth, going inside to mate with hers. He let out a low groan and backed her toward the bed. "Sit down." She sat on the side of the bed, while he dropped to his knees to remove her shoes. Once they were out of the way, he slowly reached under her petticoat and rolled her stocking down her leg. His touch both shocked and aroused her as she watched the powerful man before her acting as her servant. Once her stockings were gone, he pulled her to her feet and untied her corset. Once the strings were undone, he pushed it down over her hips to the floor. She stood before him in only her white petticoat, embarrassed to realize that although she only had her petticoat and drawers on, he was still fully clothed. He'd left his jacket downstairs, but other than that, he was wearing exactly what he'd worn to the church for their wedding. She reached up and untied his tie for him, placing it on top of the dresser, and then her fingers tackled the buttons of his pristine white shirt. She pushed his shirt off his shoulders and ran her hands over his chest, which was covered with only a white undershirt. She pushed the undershirt up and over his head, her hands tangling in the hair covering his slim chest. "Don't stop there," he mumbled, taking her hands and putting them on the waistband of his pants. "I'm still wearing something." She blushed and removed her hands. "We have to get your shoes and socks off first, don't we?" Putting her hands on his shoulders, she pushed him down on the side of the bed, kneeling before him to remove his shoes the same as he had done for her. After the shoes were gone, her fingers slid up the leg of his trousers and removed his socks. When she was finished, she stood up. She wasn't bold enough to remove his slacks for him, and she hoped he didn't request it of her. He seemed to understand how she felt, because he moved his hands to the shoulders of her petticoat and pushed it off, watching as it fell to the floor. Her drawers came next, and he removed them quickly before scooping her up into his arms and carrying her to the bed, laying her down on one side of it. She stared up at him with wide eyes as he slowly lowered himself beside her, kissing her shoulder and neck. He cupped her face in both hands and lowered his lips to hers, his tongue immediately seeking entrance to her mouth. She parted her lips and stroked his bare shoulders as he kissed her with more passion than before. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he whispered against her lips. She explored his back with her hands, finding a mole just above the waistband of his slacks. She couldn't believe how hot his skin felt underneath her fingertips. His lips roamed from her mouth, down to her neck, and then across her shoulders. One hand cupped her pink-tipped breast and he squeezed it in his palm. His thumb and forefinger toyed with her nipple as his teeth gently grazed her shoulder. She arched under his touch, loving the feel of his hands on her. She wondered in the back of her mind why he hadn't yet removed his pants, because even she knew they needed to be off for what they were about to do. His hand moved from her breast down over her stomach and to the triangle of curls shielding her innocence. He stroked his fingers over her for a moment, before moving his hand down further to the juncture of her thighs. She kept her legs tightly together, too nervous to do anything else, until he reached his hand down and tickled her knee. She giggled slightly and turned under him, at which point he slid his hand between her thighs. His fingers worked their way up her inner thigh to her core, and touched her softness. Ellen jerked as she felt Patrick's hand move against her most secret place. He ran his finger over her, and finally found her opening, one finger slipping inside and moving within her. She was startled by his finger, and opened her mouth to protest, but when the finger moved inside her, she felt such pleasure she immediately closed her mouth, and settled back against the pillow to simply enjoy what he was doing to her. Her breath was coming fast and furiously. She'd never dreamed a man could make her feel so weak in her stomach with the simple touch of his finger. She lay enjoying his touch and the feeling of something building inside her. Her stomach clenched, fighting against whatever was happening to her. His mouth returned to hers and she eagerly parted her lips, her hands clenching against his back as she silently urged him to continue whatever he was doing to make her feel so good. He reached out to turn down the kerosene lamp beside the bed, and stood up. She couldn't tell what he was doing, but when he returned, it was without his pants or anything else between them. His hands framed her face as he kissed her passionately while settling his legs between her own. His face lifted from hers briefly. "I'm sorry, but I think this is going to hurt a little." She nodded, and then realized he probably couldn't see it in the dark. "Will it hurt you, too?" He let out a low laugh. "No, it's only going to feel good to me." "Well, that's not very fair, is it? I'll do my best to make it feel as good for you as I possibly can." His mouth was on hers again before she could protest, and then she felt something pressing against her where his fingers had been only moments before. It was much hotter and bigger than his fingers, though, and she wiggled a little to escape the pressure. "Hold still." She grabbed onto his shoulders and held onto him as he finally pushed inside her. It didn't seem to hurt at all, and she was happy about that. For a moment he stopped and lifted his head. "Okay, so far?" "Yes, it doesn't hurt at all. It feels kind of good." She was relieved to realize the pain wasn't going to happen after all. "Good. Just remember that feeling for a moment, okay?" He pulled out a little and pushed hard into her, breaking her maidenhead. His mouth dropped to hers to stifle the small cry of pain she let out, and he remained still inside her, giving her time to adjust to his presence inside her body. After a short while, he lifted his head again. "Are you all right?" She lay beneath, panting, and considered his question. It certainly didn't hurt as much as it had just moments before. "I think so." His lips crushed down on hers again as he began moving inside her. She didn't feel the same good sensations she had when he'd used his fingers, but it didn't hurt anymore either. After a moment, the good feelings started coming back and she let out a low moan against his lips. He increased the speed of his movements and let out a groan, collapsing on top of her. He buried his face against her neck, but did his best to catch most of his weight on his elbows so he wouldn't hurt her. "I'm sorry. I'll try to go slower next time." "Why are you sorry?" He hadn't done anything she hadn't been willing for him to do. Why would he apologize? He laughed. "You'll understand next time. I promise you that." He rolled to her side and pulled her against him, cradling her head against his shoulder. She snuggled against him happily, pleased their first time together was over, and feeling like she'd pleased him. "Did you like it?" she asked, needing to be certain he'd enjoyed it. "I couldn't have liked it any more than I did." He dropped a kiss on top of her head. "You were wonderful." She sighed contentedly and let out a loud yawn. "I'm so tired." He smiled, stroking her back. "You just go to sleep then." She nodded, her head still pillowed on his shoulder, and she closed her eyes, knowing she'd sleep soundly. She was married now, and she'd done her duty by her husband. She was thrilled to know she'd done the right thing. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. She woke during the night to feel hands stroking her body. Teeth were softly scraping her ear and a hand was plucking insistently at one of her nipples. She moaned softly, arching against his hand. Patrick dropped his mouth to hers, kissing her wildly. "I tried to wait, but I woke up, and you were pressed against me, and I just had to have you again." Her hands went to his shoulders, exploring his taut skin. She hadn't expected him to be ready to do this again so soon, but she had heard that men had stronger physical needs than women did. Within moments, she was ready to have him inside her again. How could she tell him that, though? She spread her legs silently, and he lifted his mouth from hers. "Are you ready?" She blushed, happy the darkness hid it from him. "I think so," she whispered. He settled between her spread thighs again, and this time when he entered her there was no pain. He began moving inside her, his strokes slow and steady. The building pressure inside her stomach started right away this time. She was reaching for something, but she didn't know what it was. He seemed to know, though, because he whispered, "Just let it happen." Her head turned from side to side as she fought whatever strange thing was happening to her body. Finally, with a gasp, she felt as if her insides exploded. She arched up against him, almost lifting him off the bed with her hips. He continued moving inside her, increasing the speed now that she'd finished and with a groan, collapsed against her. "Now do you understand why I was sorry the first time?" She could barely understand his words because he was so out of breath as he spoke. "Is that what you wanted to happen for me the first time?" He rolled off of her to his side and once again gathered her against him. "It was worth waiting for, wasn't it?" She nodded, her hair rubbing against his shoulder. "It definitely was." She kissed his shoulder, her eyes already closing as she drifted back to sleep. Her last waking thought was about how embarrassed she'd be to face him in the morning, but how good she felt at that moment. She could get used to the physical side of marriage very quickly. It was much better than her friends had let on. He ran his hand over her shoulders and held her while she slept. He was so happy to have this precious woman in his life. How could a man ask for anything more? Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Because Alice took Sundays off, Ellen slipped out of bed early the following morning. She wanted to start her first full day of marriage off right and have breakfast ready when Patrick came down the stairs. She hurried around the kitchen frying bacon and getting out eggs, and only then realizing she didn't know how he preferred them cooked. Deciding scrambled was probably the best bet, she pulled down a bowl and beat 6 eggs with milk. When Patrick walked into the kitchen, she had 2 plates ready to go. She'd fixed bacon, scrambled eggs and toast with butter. Thinking he may want jam on his toast, she put that on the small table in the kitchen as well. Not ready to meet his eyes after their night together, she asked if he was hungry. He walked across the kitchen and tilted her chin up with one finger, kissing her softly. "Good morning." "Good morning." She put the plates on the table and poured them each a cup of coffee. "I hope you like scrambled eggs." "Sure. I'll eat them however you make them. I just prefer them not to be raw." She laughed. "I don't tend to serve them raw." She walked across the kitchen to the table and sat down in the chair she'd eaten breakfast in every morning all week. He sat down opposite her. "Why are we eating in the kitchen?" She shrugged. "I've been eating breakfast in the kitchen all week. I guess we can move to the dining room if you want to. I've just enjoyed talking to Alice while I eat." She hadn't thought about how it might seem strange to him to eat in the kitchen instead of the dining room. "That's fine. Are we going to church this morning?" He nodded. "Of course. We'll go to the same church we married in. There aren't any others in town, I'm afraid." She moved her eggs around on her plate with her fork. "What will we do after church?" She couldn't wait to spend her first full day with him. A lazy Sunday together sounded like a perfect way to start their marriage. He sighed. "I'm afraid I'll have to go into work after church. I didn't get some work done that I was supposed to do yesterday. I'll have to catch it up today." He seemed genuinely annoyed he had to spend the day at work. She frowned and looked into his face for the first time that morning. "Do you usually work on Sundays?" There wouldn't even be any servants at home to talk to. Her sister would be spending the day with her new husband. What was she going to do with her day? He shook his head. "I try not to. I have some paperwork I need to catch up on. I meant to bring it home so I could work on it here, but I forgot it at the bank in my rush to get everything organized yesterday. It'll be easier to just do it there than bring it home. Will you come home for lunch first?" She could fix him something quick and delicious and have him in awe of her cooking skills. "I'll grab something there." I keep crackers and jerky in the office for when I need to skip meals to get things done. She sighed and looked down at her plate. She couldn't believe their first full day as husband and wife would be spent apart. Why had she pictured days and nights full of him when they talked about marriage? She knew he had a business to run, and she shouldn't be upset. That's fine. I'll make sure I fix something for dinner. He nodded absently. I should be home by 6 or 6:30. She put the breakfast dishes in the sink to soak before going back upstairs to dress for church. She'd have plenty of time to do them later. After church, he walked her home, and with an absent kiss on her cheek, he walked back toward the bank. As she watched him go, she wondered if her life would always consist of being alone while he worked. Had she made the right choice? She made herself a light lunch, and boiled a chicken that she could deb one for the chicken and dumplings she planned on making for dinner. Then she tackled the dirty dishes in the sink, and though it didn't need it, she got down on her knees and scrubbed the kitchen floor. She went upstairs and stripped the bed as well as the bed her sister had slept in while she was there. Changing both sets of sheets, she washed the dirty and hung them on the line. Once that was finished, she stood and looked for something to do. She hated sitting around idly, but on Sundays, even the servants were off, and she was completely alone. She thought about going over to visit with her sister, but she didn't think Wesley would welcome her presence so early in their marriage because it had gotten off to such a rocky start. Finally, she curled up in the parlor and read a book on banking she'd found in his study. Maybe if she understood his work better, they could talk about it in the evenings, and he'd be more willing to share his day with her. She was only a few pages in when she realized that it was so dull there was no way she could make herself concentrate on it. Wandering around the house, she explored every room, something she hadn't yet bothered to do. It was a pretty house, and she liked it. There were 5 bedrooms upstairs, and she knew that there were 2 servants' quarters in the back of the house where Mrs. Smith and Alice lived. Alice had mentioned a gardener who worked there, and she'd seen him a few times, but he didn't live on the property. As she looked around, she searched for something she could clean, but the house was already immaculate. What was she supposed to do with her time? She wandered back to the kitchen and removed the chicken from the stove. She'd wait until it was cool before deboning it and making the dumplings. She lifted the chicken out into a bowl and washed the pot. Usually, she just used the pot for the dumplings without washing it, but she was so desperate for something to do, she decided to wash it instead. She wandered out into the back garden, looking for weeds she could pull. Certainly there was something outside she could do to make the house look nicer. She spotted only one, and pounced on it excitedly, pulling it with a vengeance. Ellen looked carefully but couldn't find another. She'd so hoped there would be something more to do there. Finally at 5, she deboned the chicken and mixed up the dumplings. She washed the bowl she'd had the chicken in during that time and remained in the kitchen as the dumplings cooked. The dumplings were done at exactly 6, and she was glad they were ready on time. She slipped the pot into the oven to keep them warm, because he could be as late as 6:30. Curling up in the parlor with another book, this one a novel by Mark Twain, she waited for Patrick. Glancing at the clock every 5 minutes didn't speed up his arrival, she found. She became entranced in the story of a young boy who manipulated people into doing what he needed, but still waited. At 7, she glanced at the clock again, and he still wasn't there. She was thankful she'd had the foresight to put their meal in the oven, but wondered just how late he'd be working. Finally, at just after 8, he came into the house, looking tired. She didn't say a word about how late he was but couldn't help but wonder if things were always going to be this way. It wasn't a good way to start their marriage. "I've got chicken and dumplings keeping warm in the oven." He nodded. "I'm hungry." "Thanks." He automatically went into the dining room and sat down, so she removed the pot from the oven and served them each a plate, taking it to him there. She gave him water to drink, because she wasn't sure what he'd want. She couldn't help but wonder why she'd been in such a hurry to start a marriage when he was so much more attentive when they were just courting. She took her seat to his right and picked up her fork. Did you get your work done? He nodded. I finished up the project I told you about, but then remembered there was something else I was supposed to have done before tomorrow morning, so I did that as well. He took a bite of the chicken. This is good. She hadn't really eaten anything yet that day, but found her appetite was gone once again. What happened to the man who had been in a hurry to hold her hand and kiss her on the porch? I'm glad you got it all finished. He sighed. Well, not all. I'll need to go to my study for a little while tonight and do the last of it. He reached out and squeezed her hand as if realizing she was there for the first time. How was your day? She simply shrugged, not willing to tell him she'd been bored out of her mind and had descended to cleaning things that were already clean so she'd have something to do. It was okay. I missed you, though. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here today. Things happen sometimes and I need to take care of them. After dinner, he wandered off to his study, and she took care of the dishes. She wondered if he would always be that way. She hoped not, but she didn't feel like she had the right to complain. She'd chosen him, and that was that. After she finished the dishes, she looked in on him in his study, and he was bent over his desk, writing madly. I'm going to go on up to bed, she said. It's been a long day. A long, boring day. He didn't even glance up from his work as he said, I'll be up soon. She changed into her nightgown and climbed between the sheets staring at the dark ceiling for what felt like hours before she finally drifted off. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. When Patrick finally finished his work, he glanced at the clock and saw that it was already after midnight. He sighed. It wasn't the way he'd wanted to start his first day as a married man, but sometimes work had to take priority. He walked up the stairs and tiptoed into his bedroom, doing his best not to wake Ellen. Would it be wrong to wake her up? He sighed, deciding it would be wrong. He'd practically ignored her all day, and she was sound asleep. There was no way she'd want to make love to a man who would do that on their first day married. He undressed and slipped into bed beside her, pulling her against him and kissing the top of her head. Tomorrow he'd find more time to spend with her, he promised himself.